Hi guys, today we're going to go through the cycles of matter, the three that you've been learning, the water cycle, carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. So I'm going to start with the easiest one, which is always going to be the water cycle. If we look at this lovely little diagram here, we've got the ocean. I know it's a little hard without color, but we have the ocean. And then from the ocean, we are going to see that the sun is going to drive the water cycle. So it's going to be hot. It's going to cause that water to rise, and it's going to rise in the form of evaporation, and that evaporation is going to head up towards the sky. So when you go from water to in a liquid form to water in a gaseous form, it rises. And then eventually it starts to stick to particles that are up in the atmosphere. And when it sticks to those particles, it condenses. Same thing that you see when you are taking a shower, the water vapor condenses on the mirror. That's why you have foggy mirror. Or you're drinking a cold drink on a hot summer's day and you get the condensation, that liquidy water that starts to run down the outside of the glass. So we get condensation, which creates our clouds. And that condensation, if it gets heavy enough and heavy enough and heavy enough, it will fall. And it falls as precipitation. Now, when you think of precipitation, we think of stuff like rain. If it's cold outside, it can fall as snow, sleet, all those other options as well. So that precipitation falls all over. If it falls in places where it can then go into the ground, it will infiltrate into the ground and become part of the groundwater. If it starts to flow into places where it's not going to get sucked into the ground, so like if you look at the side of this mountain here, it's going to run off and then end up into lakes, rivers, streams, and eventually the ocean. So we call that runoff. That happens a lot around by us because we have turned a lot of our land from green space to cement, and the water can't infiltrate into the cement, so it runs off, runs down our curbs and into our sewer systems. There's another word on here called transpiration. And transpiration is the evaporation of water from plants. So that's found over here. If you've ever been in a corn maze and like around Halloween time, the stalks are really tall, they're all around you, and you walk through that corn maze, it's pretty humid and muggy. And the reason for that is all that corn is actually giving off its water due to the sun evaporating from it. We do the same thing, perspiration. We sweat, it gets evaporated off of us, and that's what cools us down. So water is super important to us. It's used by our cells, tissues, organs to regulate temperature and maintain body functions. So we need to be able to take in water to survive in life and to make sure all of our body functions as it's normally supposed to do. The next important cycle is the carbon cycle. So carbon is super important for us. Most, if not all, the molecules within our body actually contain carbon to some extent. And we learned this when we were doing the Africa storyline. And we went through and explored the digestive system and what was being broken down with carbohydrates and lipids and all of that. And each of those actually contained carbon, carbohydrates. Sugars contain DNA, protein, fats, etc. So we wouldn't be able to make or consume any of this stuff if carbon didn't exist. Now, we need it again to live, to grow, to reproduce, to make all those molecules. So carbon is an interesting one. We usually find carbon as a gas up in the atmosphere. Okay, it's not useful to us as a gas. It's only useful to us as a solid. So when you're breathing right now, you're taking in a little bit of carbon dioxide and you're giving off carbon dioxide through the process of respiration. But it is not a useful tool for us. We can't take that in as we breathe in and just start to make all these molecules we need. It has to be fixed into a specific, solid form in order for us to be able to utilize it. So there's only really one avenue down for carbon. Carbon can come out of the atmosphere from a gas down to Earth's surface through the process of photosynthesis. And we've learned about this already. We know that carbon and sunlight and water are used by plants, and then oxygen is given off as a byproduct, and sugars are then made and created within the plant. Well, those sugars contain carbon. So as an animal, we would eat the plants and we would then consume our carbon that way. Or we eat an animal that eats plants and we get carbon that way. So The process of producers or plants in this cycle is extremely important, because if this stuff doesn't get into plants first, we don't get it. We don't survive. So once it's in animals, animals can actually do respiration. Again, we give off CO2. Well, that respiration then goes off back to the atmosphere and puts carbon back up to the gaseous form in the atmosphere. When animals poop or when they die, they also give off carbon, and that will get broken down by decomposers, and it will either stay in the ground, which then gets taken up by plants, or it gets released back to the atmosphere as a gas. Another way carbon can actually get put up into the atmosphere is through burning or combustion, whether that's fossil fuels from your car or a factory. Maybe you're burning campfire or anything else. But that process of burning contributes CO2 back up to the atmosphere. So there's many ways carbon dioxide can get up to the atmosphere. There's really only one way carbon can get fixed into a form that's useful for us. So it's extremely important that plants stay around on this planet, because we wouldn't be able to receive the carbon that we need. The last cycle is the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle is a bit more difficult. Just like the carbon cycle, we rely on decomposers and we rely on producers to help us cycle this. Nitrogen, just like carbon, is not useful to us unless it's in a solid form. So it has to be converted from a gas down to the actual ground for plants to be able to take in and for us to actually ingest it. So why is nitrogen so important? Nitrogen is a building block for amino acids. It helps us create DNA. If you remember back to nucleotides, nucleotides are nitrogen bases with the sugar and the phosphate. So the sugar contains the carbon, all that fun stuff. So again, nitrogen and carbon are super important for the simple things that make us us. Nitrogen is actually a really abundant gas in the atmosphere. So we see it again in a form more frequently than not that is not useful to us. So when we're breathing in air, we take in a lot of nitrogen, but we can't do anything with it. To make it useful to us, though, if you take a look right here, there's special bacteria that lives on the roots of certain plants, like legumes. Legumes are stuff like peas and beans. So on the roots of these plants, there are these little tiny bacteria, friendly bacteria, that will actually take nitrogen from a gas form and turn it into a form that the plants can then take in. So we call this process nitrogen fixing, because it fixes the nitrogen from an unhelpful source into a source that's more usable for us. So that bacteria fixes it. Once that nitrogen now is down in the soil, the plants can take it up and get it into their system. Once it's in plants, animals will eat plants and get the nitrogen that they need to make their DNA molecules. So nitrogen gets into the animals. We either eat the plants or we eat the animal that eats the plants, and we get our nitrogen that's necessary. Throughout this process, though, again, we know that animals are going to poop, give off waste, they're going to die. Some process is going to happen, and it's going to need to be broken down. And as that process gets broken down, whether that process is the waste or the animal gets broken down, nitrogen is put back into the soil, which then can get sucked up by plants, or it gets sent back up to the atmosphere through bacteria and released as a nitrogen gas. Okay, forgot to put this back in here. So nitrogen enters back into the plants. Woo! So again, bacteria are super important in this process because they can help keep nitrogen and carbon back in the soil, get it to the plant. Plants are super important because, again, if we don't get nitrogen and carbon to the plants first, we can't then eat the plants to get what we need. So if you have questions on the cycles of matter, please ask, but this is the best rundown that we can give you as of right now. We'll go through a few more things, but you can see how animals and plants and decomposers and bacteria all play a role in this process.